So my name is Crystal Yan. I actually, when I was in school, I studied economics, but there was a field within microeconomics that was particularly interesting to me. So it was this field, emerging field called behavioral economics, and it was sort of at the intersection of economics and psychology. There's a key principle in classical economics that people are rational and they act in their own best interests. And this field was all about sort of debunking that common understanding that sometimes people are irrational and they don't act in their best interests. And that was when I first started to think about, the relevance of what I was thinking in this academic context to the field of user experience. Today I work for an organization called the United States Digital Service, and I work for a team there at the Department of Health and Human Services, and specifically we've been doing a lot of work with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the U.S. Digital Service is actually a startup itself. We're a federal government agency, but we've only been around for about 4 years. We originally started after the healthcare.gov crisis, when the CTO of the US at the time, Todd Park, recruited a bunch of people from Silicon Valley and within his own network to come to Washington and help sort of fix healthcare.gov. And after that, he and Obama thought, what would it look like if we had people who just knew technology that were embedded in the government from the very start of a project instead of coming to fix it at the end once it failed? Because a lot of government IT projects fail. And so that's where the idea for the U.S. Digital Service came to be. It also came from a program that started around this time called the Presidential Innovation Fellows. But the key difference between this program, which still exists today, is that the U.S. Digital Service really focuses on sending teams of people to work with agencies. So if you've ever worked within a very large company and you felt like you were the only person who really understood how you should be developing software or how you should be doing user experience and human-centered design, and there were hundreds of people around you or thousands of people around you who wanted to plan every single detail, that's probably what it felt like to be a Presidential Innovation Fellow in those first few days, to be like the one person who was bringing a lot of these ideas and philosophies into a government agency that had been around and doing something a different way for a very long time. And as you can imagine, in government, the idea of trying to fail fast doesn't really work as well because you don't want to fail. And if you fail and you fail to deliver a critical service, then people could end up dying. And so we're all about trying to bring sort of the idea of doing things iteratively, but in a smart way, understanding that we are working within the context of the government. And our whole mission is to use human-centered design and modern technology software development practices to help the government deliver better services to the American people. We have teams at the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Small Business Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, and then the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the team that I work on. And just to give you a little bit more context in terms of what our team believes when it comes to designing for trust in the context of healthcare, we really believe that the future of healthcare should be focused on empowering patients. And if you think about, your role today, when you go to the doctor, if you were to try to turn around and ask your doctor for a copy of your medical records, data that is about you, they might give you a really crazy look. And one of my coworkers actually did that once. And they sort of, stared at her quite blankly, and then a couple hours later gave her a CD. And I don't know about you, but I don't even have somewhere where I could put a CD today. So we really think that part of this mission should be focused on making sure that technologists and policymakers are in the same room. Because what often happens when it comes to doing government technology is there's someone who works in policy, and they put together all of these requirements that are really product requirements, but it's because in the policymaking process, they're like, hey, there should be a rule for this, there should be a rule for that, and then, a couple months or even a couple years later, someone actually has to implement that, and it might not be technologically feasible, or it just might not make sense. So one example I can tell you is for a project that my team worked on, which I'll talk to you about a little bit more later, it was written into the law that a particular part of the website had to be called the CMS web interface. And there were many other websites as a part of this program that were all technically web interfaces. But this particular part of the program had to do with, claims submission. So if it were up to us, the product people, we might have just named it what it did, like claim submission, but we were required by law to name it something else, which didn't actually describe what it did. So as you can imagine, that's kind of a minor complaint, but there's sometimes more serious complaints where something could be written into law. It really sets your product strategy, and you really can't fix it a couple years later when you're required also by law to implement it. So that's a little bit more about some of the challenges that we're working with and how we're trying to get ahead of the process by being a part of that policymaking process. And for those of you who, aren't aware, Medicare is actually the largest health insurance program in the country. We serve 55 million people, and the payments that go through Medicare comprise about 3.5% of the US economy. We're also the single largest payer, which means that when we do something to really advance technology in the healthcare space, we're really trying to ask the market to demand that of private payers as well. So we're hoping that by trying to make data more available, by trying to make patient data more accessible to them, we can sort of encourage the market to demand that from private payers as well. So for those of you who aren't covered by Medicare, so because Medicare, you have to be 65 or older, you're probably on a private payer plan. And the work that we do can't directly help you get access to your medical records, but we're trying to, we're hoping that we can really push the market to make sure that your payer is encouraged by other players in the market to do the same. So now that you have a little bit more context about where I'm coming from, what group I'm coming from, and some of the challenges that we work with that are unique to government, I want to just sort of go back and talk a little bit more about why this topic matters to me, why designing for trust matters, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about 3 lessons that I've learned when it comes to designing for trust. And I'll walk you through how we integrated each of those lessons for a program that we launched this year called the Quality Payment Program. And then finally, I'll open up to questions. So why does designing for trust matter? And why is this thing that seems to be my problem also a problem for all of us? I don't know about you, but I never thought that I was actually going to work for the government. I thought that I really liked being able to create my own rules. You don't really get to do that much in government. But I really think that before I joined the government, my idea of what the government was a lot of unpleasant experiences in my life. So I thought about, the time that I have to go to the DMV. And everyone there looks so unhappy. The people who are waiting in line there and the people who are working there. I thought about my experiences filing taxes. I remember one year, they were trying to get some information about me, asking for more information, and they mailed it to me, but I had just moved, and then it kept getting mailed to me, and then they sent me finally an email to log into an online system to check a message, but I didn't actually know what my password was, and it was really hard to reset it, and I would call a phone number. And all my experiences with the DMV, with the IRS, they were really pretty horrible, and I didn't love interacting with the government, let alone trust it. And I think this is probably true for most people who, in terms of their interactions with the government. The interesting thing is, when I talk to people, when I'm doing a lot of user research for a number of our projects, I'm interviewing people who are interacting with the government, and I'm also interviewing people who are within the government who are building the systems to support those people. And what I hear often a lot is, oh, I don't know about that process. It's another group that manages it. And I don't know about you, but when I was interacting with my local DMV, or I was interacting with IRS, which is at the federal level, I thought of them both as the government. And if I had a bad experience at the DMV, that gave me a negative perception of how to interact with government, so that if I went to deal with another branch of government, I already didn't trust it. And I don't know, but I think that this is really a key difference between in the field of user experience when we talk about customer journey mapping and when we talk about service blueprinting. So I think this picture really illustrates pretty well the difference between those two. If you think about this in the context of a play, right? What you see on the front stage, or what the audience sees, that's your customer journey map. So for your end user, it could be someone, they have to go to one place. If, say, they're starting a new business, they have to go to one office to make sure they get certain licenses. They have to go to another office to maybe file some paperwork. All of these complex interactions are their journey. And what's behind that, what's backstage in this play, are all those different branches of an organization that are supporting their experience. So before I worked at the USCS, I worked for a startup. And in the context of our customer journey map, we thought about our customers' interactions with our account management team, our sales team, their interactions with our mobile app, our web app. And then the backstage was all the different departments within the company who sort of helped support that experience. So when it comes to trust, we didn't realize at the time, but sometimes when we were building something in the product, so I was on the product team, we might occasionally reference someone's experience interacting with the sales team or the account management team, but it actually took a while until we actually built out a document outlining all of this, that we realized that maybe they didn't trust a certain thing because they had a bad experience with asking a question of customer support. And it really helped us bring together all these different departments to make sure we were on the same page about how we want to design for trust, what messages did we want to use for like the error pages or the blank landing pages, and was that consistent with a message that we were giving people when someone spoke to them over the phone. So you might be thinking, even though I've been talking about this in the context of government and also at a startup, why does this matter to you? I think it might be true that most people have never really trusted the government, but I think even particular today, in this year at this time, sometimes people don't really trust technology companies either. I think that people are really starting to question what's hidden in all those privacy policies, and how can I make sure that when I'm sharing my data, people aren't using it in a weird way. So I think that it's even more critical for those of us who are working on emerging technology to think about how we design for trust and make sure that we're disclosing information at the right time, and then maybe in some cases not saying too much in order to confuse people. So now I want to transition to telling you about 3 lessons that I've learned when it comes to designing for trust. And these are all related to the context of 3 different disciplines within user experience. The first is data visualization, the second is user research, and third is content strategy. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that a lot of larger user experience teams are actually hiring dedicated specialists for some of these different disciplines, even as smaller organizations try to hire generalists who know a little bit about each of these different subjects. And I'll speak to these a little bit more generally and talk about how it's relevant to a particular project we worked on at USCS. But I'm also talking about this given my previous background, where I worked at a tech startup and I worked with data scientists quite often. In that case, when we were designing for trust, we were really designing for trust in our machine learning features, because a lot of people who are part of our user base just didn't really trust that. So I'll talk about some of these principles of designing for trust a little bit in the context of that, and then also in the context of designing for trust in government as well. So the first lesson that I learned when it comes to designing for trust is that often less is more. When I was at a startup, I worked with a number of data scientists who had PhDs. They were very highly educated. And I didn't really think about this in the context of working with them when I first started working with them. But I thought back to my experience in school when I was taking math classes. And you have a math problem, you're supposed to find the answer. And I would really jump to try to write down the answer and then be like, okay, I'm done. But that was never good enough because your teacher always wants you to sort of show your work. How did you get to this answer? What's your reasoning for that? And they really drill that mindset into you in school. You really have to show your work. And when I was done with school, I kind of forgot about this. But some of my colleagues that I worked with, they had been in school for much longer, and some of them came straight out of a PhD program into working in industry. So this whole mindset of showing your work was really well ingrained into them. And when I was working on a feature where we were trying to forecast the likelihood of something, like it was a predictive analytics feature. And you could sort of go about it in a couple ways. On one end of the spectrum, you could just say what your prediction was. On the other end, you could give the prediction and also all of your reasoning for that. And for my colleagues on the data science team, they really wanted to add a lot of nuance, well, it's, 85.7%, but also because of this, and this is why it's different in this state versus this other state. There are a lot of details that really matter to them because they were thinking about justifying this for someone else who also had a PhD. But for a lot of our users, they did not have a PhD and they did not care about all these details. And in fact, it actually confused them. So we learned pretty quickly that when it came to visualizing this data, it was really important to sometimes hide the details and make sure it was able to be found for someone who really wanted to look for it. But for most people, they just wanted the answer of what we recommended. I think in the context of working in government now, this is also particularly relevant because now I work with policy people. And a lot of policy people have law degrees. And in law, the details really matter, right? If you've ever tried to read a piece of legislation, it can sometimes be hundreds of pages. And part of those pages might just be exceptions to the particular rule. So you have to dig through all of that information to find out what the law really means. And I think the hard part is people who know policy, they kind of lose sight of the fact that most people don't have an interest in reading hundreds of pages to figure out what the law means for them. So it's part of our role on the user experience team within USCS to make sure we translate some of those details into what really matters to someone else. And if we're able to do that well, we can really help start to build trust in making sure that when we push out a new law, we can really translate it for someone to tell them what it means for them. The second lesson that I learned when it comes to designing for trust is that it's really important to ask the right questions. And this sort of borrows from the field of user research. So when we first started to do some user research on at the startup that I was at on some of those predictive analytics features, we started to ask questions like, does this make sense? Do you like this? And we learned very quickly that these were pretty bad questions to ask. And the reason for that was we wanted to answer to these questions, but we couldn't ask them in this way because the person sitting across from you is also a human, and they look at you and they know that you've been working on this for a couple months of your life, and they don't want to hurt your feelings if they don't like this or if they wouldn't ever use it. So they might sort of tell you, maybe, or they might just say, yes, I like it. But it might not actually accurately represent how they feel because they don't want to hurt your feelings. Then we tried to ask questions because we had trouble figuring out what we wanted to name a certain feature. So we might ask questions like, what would you do? Or what would you call this? And the challenge with this is it really threw off the rapport that we had built with the user over the course of the interview because it made them really nervous. Our users were people whose job was not to name features, and to ask them to do that was kind of stressful for them. It really put them on the spot, and it made it harder for them to answer some of our following questions. And we also really wanted an answer to this, but we couldn't ask it this way. So what we learned was to sort of find a balance between a couple of these questions that we were trying to ask so that we could get the answer, but we would phrase the question in a different way. So one thing we learned was that we really wanted to put them in the context of a situation we knew would be relevant to them. For the users of the startup that I worked at, a lot of them were in organizations where there's a good amount of turnover in their profession. So we asked a question like, imagine someone new just started on your team and they're not familiar with all the tools that your organization uses. How would you explain this and what it does to them? And that was a very realistic scenario. It made them comfortable because they could see it happening in their near future. And they were able to answer it by saying, oh, well, I would explain it does this and this. And they basically gave us the same phrases that we needed to understand what they would want to call it. But the question was just phrased in a different way. And I think the most important thing that we learned was to listen to the questions that users asked us. So I learned that it was really important to, at the start of the interview, say something like, you're probably going to have questions for us because we're going to show you things that you don't see in the product today. And for all of these questions, I might respond with a question. And I promise it's not because I'm trying to be annoying. It's because I learned so much from why you're asking me a particular question. And I promise at the end of the interview, I'll answer every single one of those questions. And it's really important to say this at the beginning, because if you don't say it and you're in the middle of the interview and your user asks you a question and you respond with a question, they can get kind of annoyed with you because it's not fun to have every question get the response of another question. So that was the next thing we learned when it came to conducting a lot of these user interviews and trying to really build that trust with our users. And the last thing we learned came from the field of content strategy or UX writing, which is that writing well really matters a lot, especially if you're trying to get rid of some of those details in the context of less is more. You really want to make sure that you write really well to communicate what you want your users to find. And I don't know about you, but I have always thought that if I weren't a user experience designer, I would want to be a journalist, because it's kind of similar. You just kind of go around, talk to a lot of people, and it's, in the field of user experience, you take all of your insights and you might design something from that. And then in the context of journalism, you take all your insights and you might write something from that. So I'd always thought, like, this is a really great opportunity to, like, practice being the journalist I was never able to be. But the problem was a lot of the publications I liked reading, they used kind of like very complex language. And when I first started to do a lot of writing within our product, I would try to emulate some of these publications. The problem was it wasn't a good fit for the brand, and it also wasn't a good fit for the user's goals, right? Because if you think about like when you use a software product, sometimes it's kind of condescending if you go to an error page and it's like too cute, because what you really want is to actually just have the page take you to where you need to go. So I really try to think about my process now is I write what comes to mind naturally first, and then I do like an audit where I edit it for the tone of voice and making sure it fits the brand. And I also make sure that I try to say as much as possible in as few words as possible. If you're looking for more resources on content strategy or UX writing, you could probably just search some of those terms and come up with a lot of resources. But 2 resources I like recommending are plainlanguage.gov and a book called Letting Go of the Words. So now I think it probably is helpful for me to just give you a quick preview of some of these lessons learned and how we integrated them into a project that we worked on at USDS. And I'll talk a little bit more about both my role in this and also my colleagues, because a lot of them got started on this project before I joined. So what you're looking at here is the website for a program that we launched this year called the Quality Payment Program. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the field of healthcare, for a number of years, legislators have been trying to push the healthcare industry from something called a fee-for-service model to a value-based care model. And what that means is that when you go to the doctor today, what you probably experience is that for every service that you get a line item in a bill for that. So you get a blood test or you get an x-ray, and for every single service, you're charged a particular fee. Now, this particular model doesn't necessarily have your interests aligned with the interests of the healthcare system, right? Because they could try to make more money off of you by giving you more x-rays that you might not actually need. So what the industry is trying to do is make sure that people get paid more based on the quality of care. How healthy is your patient? Are they getting the services that they actually need? And is that making them healthier? In order for this to actually happen, clinicians need to submit data about their patients and the quality of care to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services so that we can pay them accordingly. So this program, the Quality Payment Program, was sort of the first step to making sure this happened in Medicare specifically. So this site is a great example, I think, of that first lesson learned and that third one, because we really took all of those hundreds of pages of text and we translated it into plain language for clinicians to better understand how this law would affect them in plain language, and if this program would impact the way that they would get paid. We hid the details and replaced them with clear and concise copy. So this really is an example of both that lessons learned from content strategy, and then also from making sure you're visualizing the right details. The other thing that was really critical to making sure that we designed for trust in this program was having a very comprehensive user research program. Now, CMS is a healthcare agency. So when we first started working with them at USCS, there weren't that many people who were familiar with the terms human-centered design or user research. When we developed the QPP submission product and the API, we conducted a lot of user research, and this was a reflection of our second lesson learned for designing for trust, which was to ask the right questions. So what were the results of asking the right questions? Well, users of the submission product found it so easy to use, they were afraid they didn't actually do it. And so because we had the right channels in place to get that feedback quickly, we could iterate on this. None of this also wouldn't happen if it weren't for someone on our team who was really dedicated to asking those right questions. And that would be my colleague, Kanda Johnson. She leads the UX research program at CMS, and there are several strategies that she employed to really change the culture of the agency and their attitude towards human-centered design. The first thing she did was that she helped the people who were already doing user research recognize that they were doing user research. So there were people who, aren't familiar with a lot of the terms of our industry. They were experts in understanding very detailed parts of the healthcare system, but they would try to get feedback because they were really dedicated career public servants. They would run surveys, they would talk to people on the phone and ask them questions in order to think about how to improve the program. And they didn't consider themselves user researchers, but she really helped them get some of the language to describe what they did so that they could pattern match and think about those terms, look for additional resources, and make sure that they got the training they needed to become better at what they were already doing. The second thing she did was that she made sure that people leading different UX research efforts across organization actually talk to each other. So the government is really large and complex, and even within the same agency, sometimes it's hard for people to realize that someone else in the same building could be working on a similar initiative. So when she heard here and there that there's one group that was trying to run a diary study, and another group that was trying to get access to the same population of users and get insights about them over time, she connected the two of them and helped them organize a diary study together so that they could both get information and insights from users and use that to inform the services that their different offices offered. And then finally, when people came to her and asked for help in doing something related to user research, she never just always did it for them. She made sure that she was there to help coach them through, their first card sorting activity and gave them the tools and resources they needed to conduct more of that user research on their own, so that she wasn't the roadblock to them being able to do the research, that they were able to slowly become more able to do that research themselves. So the result of this organization that, in our engagement with them over 2 years, was able to embrace human-centered design is a product that launched 2 reviews like this. So I gave you a quick preview of some of the work that we do in our particular agency when it comes to healthcare and how we design for trust there. Designing for trust is pretty relevant to almost all the projects that we work on. For our team at the Department of Veterans Affairs, they are working on a program, I think it's called the Appeals Benefit Process. And it's essentially trying to serve people who were dishonorably discharged from the military for policies that might be related to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They might be victims of assault, or they might suffer from PTSD. And for a long time, they weren't able to access benefits that they deserved. So they're trying to build out a tool that helps them more easily appeal their status. As you can imagine, working with a population like that, I think that a number of people have had enough bad experiences with the VA that they don't necessarily trust the agency. They're really able to try to integrate user testing very continuously into their process and build that trust so that people, when they're, going through and testing some of the prototypes that they've built out, they're like, wow, I don't have to go to 3 different pages only to find like a broken link to a PDF and then fill out that PDF and have to mail it somewhere. I can just fill out a form online and actually be able to apply for a benefit. That's really critical to making sure that they have a close relationship with their users and all of those insights are informing their product development. At the Department of Homeland Security, one of our projects there is trying to make the application process for asylum easier, and then also helping make the green card application process easier. And as you can imagine, most people probably don't think of like the most positive experiences when they're thinking of the Department of Homeland Security, that sometimes it takes for some of our users when they're setting up a user interview, they might email from their email address with another agency in order to make sure that people actually reply, in order to get some of that testing done, and then slowly introduce that this is offered by a particular agency that user may not have trusted to begin with, but over time experiencing something that they've built out that's very centered with them in mind, they begin to sort of trust some of those tools. And then more importantly, we are also always hiring. So if you've ever considered or even if you haven't considered working in public service, we're hiring engineers, we're hiring product managers, designers, content strategists, UX researchers, communications folks, strategy and operations, and technical recruiters. And there might be a couple of other disciplines that I can't quite remember that we hire for, but you can go to usds.gov/join. One thing I'll say that's really unique about USDS is we have a tour of duty model. And what that means is a lot of times people join us for a limited tour of duty. So they might come for 3 to 6 months on sabbatical from their current organization. Some of them end up going back to their previous organization, which is more often than not a company like in the private sector or technology company. Some people in, just a couple months in, they go back and they say to the employer, actually, I'm not coming back. I love public service too much, and I really want to stay in civic tech. And some people, after leaving USDS, go on to work in other organizations in civic technology. There are some organizations that do work at the local level and at the state level. So you might not know it, but your state could have a digital service group, or your city could as well. And so sometimes people, after getting involved at the federal level, want to get involved at the state level or at the city level as well. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure. So, I don't know if maybe I chose the wrong word to describe that, but I think of that in the context of, good writing is something that you can like scan over quickly and just like understand. It's not like a super complex sentence that you have to read like 3 times to understand what someone is saying. Okay. Yeah. So that plays into the lessons more hiding. Sure. But my question now is leaning towards data visualization and lessons more. Yeah. So to me, there might be some building trust. You want a high-level overview. Mm-hmm. Low on detail, this could be the high visual, and then be able to drill down into specific or more detailed information, because you might want, if you're going to build trust, you might want to see what is the trust for you by drilling down. Does that play? And so I'm wondering about data visualization. Yeah. How easy is that to see for a wide audience and understand what that visualization means at a high level without like? Yeah, sure. So, so I mentioned earlier a lot of that, a lot of those lessons came from when I was working on a very data visualization heavy product at the startup I worked at before USDS. What I can say about that in terms of why in that particular case, that's what we learned was at the time we had in our predictive analytics, we not only had the number that we forecasted, so the product was a piece of software that would forecast the likelihood of a piece of state legislation passing. And so we had a number that forecast that likelihood. And then we also had a distribution graph that showed, for this particular state, I think it was like, so say like a 94% in Minnesota might mean something differently than a 94% in another state. And what we realized was that this distribution chart, a lot of people thought it was a time series graph. So they thought it was actually this number changing over time. And when they realized it wasn't that, they had a hard time trusting other parts of the platform because they were like, wait, I think there's these charts that I'm misreading and I don't really understand it. The other part that led to a little bit of mistrust was we had explanations for why we gave certain forecast scores. So we might say something like, there is bipartisan sponsorship of this bill, which means it's more likely to pass. The problem with that was it was really hard to come up with a natural language description of all of those reasonings at scale. So all of these reasons were derived from the algorithm that our data science team developed, but they were all written out in the same kinds of words, and that when people saw some of the same sentences over and over again, they were like, well, this is this number in this state, and this is a different number for another bill, but the reasons that are listed underneath seem similar. So why is that? Why are the reasons similar? Or there are, 3 positive things and 2 negative things, but it's still like a pretty low number. And we couldn't do that manually, where we would have a person write out all those explanations. But we also, at the time, couldn't quite figure out how to develop language that varied enough that it looked like it was unique for each explanation. So what we ended up doing was we tried to just make sure that the order in which all those explanations were displayed in accurately represented their weighting in the algorithm. And this at least helped build some more trust in that explanation. And then in the meantime, we were working on making sure that the data science team was refining some of that so that we could provide a little bit more detail when it came to those explanations. And that was launched sort of after this first phase of research. But that was like the next stage of the redesign. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. I'm trying to think. So probably the experience where something was oversimplified and we had to actually go back and add more information was related to what I mentioned earlier about something being too easy to use that they felt like they didn't actually do it. So I forgot to mention this, but the previous experience within the quality payment program was someone had to go to 3 different websites, all with 3 different authentication modules, and they had to go to each of those websites, download an Excel spreadsheet, edit a lot of data in that spreadsheet manually, and then re-upload it. And then a couple months later, they might get feedback that they entered something in incorrectly. And at that point, it was probably too late for them to make sure they could get a payment adjustment. And so when we built out this experience where we consolidated all of those 3 things into one place, and someone could submit it on the website, but also could submit it through an API, people thought it was, they thought there was more that they had to do that they could feel done. And we also allowed people to submit it early. And, if they submitted it okay, by the time the deadline passed, whatever they had submitted would be automatically sent over. And so what we did when we got some feedback from a number of people who actually went through all the steps, they did it right, but they thought they weren't done yet, and they started calling our support center, is we just made sure that they got a feedback message that we got their data that they had submitted, and if they wanted to check at any time between when they submitted it and when the deadline passed, they could make some changes and edit it, and there was a place where they could easily navigate to see that. And that really helped alleviate some of those anxieties. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure. So I think that when building a user research program, you really want to have all those different types of user research. I define them, I think there's a lot of people in industry who differentiate between three types of user research. The first is formative, the second is generative, and the third is evaluative. And they roughly more or less map out to the stages of a product development process. So formative research would be research that you do before you even build anything. It's research to help you figure out what you want to build in the first place. So this is probably more heavy on the qualitative research. So that might be interviews with people. It might just be, observation, following people around and trying to observe, the different pain points in their day and not just kind of being like a fly on the wall. And the second stage is generative research, which is, I think, a little bit of like co-design with your users. And the third is evaluative research, which is probably what most people think of when they think of user research. So this would be usability testing. Once you have a design in place, making sure that it's easy for people to use. I think that in this particular, in the case of the quality payment program, probably the most valuable stage was that formative research. And I think that's true for a lot of projects, actually. Because you could throw something together really quickly, and I think this is really easy for some of my colleagues that I've worked with who have an engineering background and they're working on projects. They know how to build anything, right? So they have an idea and they just start to build it, and then after they've already sunk a lot of time and effort into building something, then they try to get testing done on it, and they realize that, oh, no one actually needed this, and then all of that work they put into building it is kind of for nothing, And that's a really hard lesson to learn after you've already put in the work of building something. So I think that for any project, the most important is just formative research, making sure that people actually want the thing that you're trying to build. And if they don't, maybe through talking to them, you'll uncover other opportunities to build something else. Yeah. It's also the hardest type of user research, I think. Any other questions? Well, if not, if you have any questions that you feel like are very specific to you, I'll hang around out here at the front for a little bit longer. And then for everyone else, I guess you get to get out early and go get some snacks.